They said the wedding would be the grandest the county had ever seen. White silk gowns and brass buttons, fiddlers playing till the moon rose high, silver goblets clinking with imported wine. The master wanted the world to know his daughter was marrying into fortune, and no coin was spared in showing it. The fields had been scrubbed, cabins swept, and every enslaved hand on the plantation was bent double with work to make the day shine. But beneath the fine lace and the perfumed roses, another preparation was quietly unfolding, one not written on the guest list. 17. That was the number she carried in her mind as she stirred the pots and kneaded the bread. 17 faces, some cruel, some laughing, some smug with wealth, who would sit at that table with their forks raised high, never suspecting the woman serving them had been shaping their last meal. When the fiddles struck their tune and the first toast was made, no one saw the small tremor of a smile pass her lips. No one heard her whisper, low, bitter, and final, "Eat." By the night's end, 17 lay writhing on the polished floor, their fine garments soaked with vomit and wine, their lips blue as the Carolina twilight. And she, Dinah, daughter of no free name, had done what no whip, no chain, no auction block could erase. She had made them remember her. The Carolina sun was merciless, beating down on rows of cotton that stretched farther than the eye could see. The air carried the heavy sweetness of magnolia blossoms, mixed with the sour stench of sweat, leather, and iron. Cicadas shrilled in the trees like 1,000 rattles, their cries rising above the groans of bending backs and the crack of the overseeder's whip. This was Belclair Plantation, 2,000 acres of cotton and tobacco, with its big house perched on the highest rise like a whitewashed crown. To the visitors who came in carriages, it was the picture of prosperity. Broad verandas, marble steps, windows trimmed in gold. But to those who lived beneath it, bound in chains and fear, it was a prison without walls. Dinah had lived here all her life. She could not say how old she was, maybe 20, maybe more, but the lines carved into her palms told their own story. She had learned to pick cotton before she had learned to spell her name, and she had learned to keep her face blank before she learned to smile. The mistress, Mrs. Eliza Harrow, liked to say Dinah had the look of a quiet girl, which in her eyes meant obedient, uncomplaining, invisible. Dinah let her believe it. Silence, she had learned, was safer than truth. But Dinah's silence was not emptiness. It was a vessel, and inside it she stored everything. The screams of her mother taken at auction when Dinah was a child, the laughter of the master, Thomas Harrow, when he boasted about the whip, the way the children of the house tossed scraps at the enslaved children as if they were dogs. Every memory, every cruelty, every humiliation, they sat inside her like stones, heavy, waiting. The cabins lay in a crooked row behind the big house, each one no bigger than a stable, their walls patched with mud and straw. At night the enslaved gathered there, voices hushed, bodies broken, but spirits still alive in whispers and song. Dinah often sat by the fire, her eyes catching the glow of embers, listening. Old voices spoke of roots and herbs, of healing, of spirits that walked with them even in bondage. Some spoke, too, of poisons, leaves and berries that could still the strongest man's breath. Dinah listened most carefully to those. Her days belonged to the kitchen. She woke before dawn, kneaded dough until her arms ached, stirred stews thick with lard and spice, and polished silver that would never touch her lips. She was always there, always moving, yet to the family she was less than a shadow. That invisibility was both a curse and a gift. They did not see her, so they did not see the way her eyes lingered. She watched what they ate,
how they drank, who they trusted. She watched who mocked her, who struck her, who laughed while another bled. She remembered every face. And on a sweltering afternoon in July, she learned there would be a wedding. The news carried through the quarters like smoke. The master's eldest daughter, Catherine Harrow, was to marry into the Whitmore family, one of the wealthiest in the county. It was to be the grandest celebration Belclare had ever seen. Guests would come from 3 towns over, with wagons of gifts and barrels of fine liquor. The enslaved were ordered to double their work. Fields tended, cabins whitewashed, kitchens prepared for feasting.
For weeks, the plantation boiled with activity. Dinah's hands blistered from baking bread by the dozen, her back bent from hauling water, her ears ringing with the mistress's endless demands. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something began to stir inside her. A wedding meant abundance, food, drink, carelessness, a gathering of all the faces she remembered, gathered in one room, blind in their laughter. Dinah did not remember her father. Some said he had been sold down the river, taken to a cotton plantation in Mississippi, where men disappeared into the night and never returned. Her mother, Martha, had been a small woman with hands scarred from hard labor and a voice that trembled but never broke. She told stories sometimes of Africa, of distant rivers and forests where people sang to the moon, but those tales were snatched away by the harsh whistles of the overseer. Even as a child, Dinah learned the patterns of fear. She learned how to move quietly when the master's boots rang on the floorboards. She learned that a stumble could mean a lash, a word spoken out of turn could mean a chain. She learned to watch, to memorize, and above all, to survive. Her mother had tried to protect her. She had taught Dinah about herbs that could soothe pain, leaves that could clean a wound, roots that could make a fever break. Sometimes, when the mistress was away, Martha would whisper, "Knowledge is the one thing they cannot take from you, child. Keep it close. Keep it safe." Dinah remembered the night her mother was taken. She had been only 7. A wagon rolled up the dirt path, men shouting, ropes swinging. Martha had hugged her tightly, whispered, "Do not cry, do not beg. Remember who you are, Dinah. Remember everything." And then she was gone, sold to a plantation across the river. The screams of the cabin echoed in Dinah's ears for months afterward, a memory she could never wash away. After that night, Dinah became 2 people. There was the little girl who still wanted to run and hide, who still dreamed of fields not touched by whips, and there was the other, the part of her that learned the rhythms of the plantation, that listened and observed, that stored every cruelty like a seed waiting for soil. School was a cruel joke. Some of the master's children were taught letters and numbers, but Dinah was left to learn in secret. She watched the children, memorized words, traced them in the dust with a stick. At night, by candlelight stolen from the kitchen, she copied letters on scraps of parchment, hiding her writing under loose floorboards. Words became power. Knowledge became invisible chains she wrapped around herself, stronger than any rope. The first time she realized her anger could be dangerous was when she was 10. A boy from the neighboring cabin had been caught stealing corn and was whipped in front of the others. Dinah had watched the overseer raise the whip and felt something ignite in her chest, a heat she could not name. She had taken a rock from the yard and thrown it at the overseer's boot.
It missed, but the fire in her belly stayed. That fire grew as the years went on. Every insult, every lash, every stolen piece of bread, every mocking laugh was added to a ledger only she could see. The plantation was a classroom, and her education was brutal. The cruelty of humans, the weakness of the powerful, the ways the world ignored the powerless. By the time Dinah was 15, she was already quietly clever. She could steal food from the kitchens without the cook noticing. She could move through the fields like a shadow, unseen by overseer or master. She knew which herbs could soothe pain, which could sicken an animal, and she remembered every detail of every face she encountered. And always in the quiet of the night, she whispered the one thing she could never say aloud. "They will pay, someday." That whisper was her lullaby, her promise, and the seed of the plan that would one day unfold at the grandest wedding Belleclaire had ever known. Even as she bent over the cotton, her small hands raw from picking, Dinah's mind was never on the fibers of the plant, but on the patterns of people, their laughter, their arrogance, their careless cruelty, all catalogued and stored, ready for a reckoning only she could deliver. The chains of her childhood had forged her, and now, as a young woman, Dinah was no longer a girl. She was a shadow with memory, a mind honed sharper than the master's finest knife. And she waited.
The big house loomed over the fields like a sentinel, its white columns gleaming in the sun, its windows always watching. Inside, the air was always too warm, perfumed with oils and candles that stung the nose, and full of the sharp voices of the family. Here, Dinah was not invisible. She was a tool, a servant, a shadow meant to anticipate desires, hide mistakes, and bear witness without comment. Mrs. Eliza Harrow was a woman of delicate appearance, her gowns always flawless, her hair pinned high with jewels that caught the sunlight like shards of glass. Yet her beauty was a weapon, honed to cut with words and glances. She had a habit of running her sharp nails along Dinah's arms when displeased, a gesture that was meant to remind the young woman that she was property, nothing more. "Careful with the wine, girl," Eliza would hiss, her voice thin but edged with steel. "Do you want the Whitmores to think we are slovenly?" Dinah's hands, steady as ever, would not falter. She inclined her head, her lips a tight line. Carelessness was dangerous. Words, gestures, even a look could be twisted into guilt. Her master, Thomas Harrow, was cruel in ways that could not always be seen. He had a charm that made outsiders trust him, but under that veneer was a man who thrived on domination. Dinah had learned the rhythms of his moods, the flicker of his eye before a lash, the way his laughter could turn into a threat, the small, sharp touches of hands where no one could see. Dinah's memories were full of his assaults, how he would claim her for hours, leaving her trembling in corners of the kitchen or storeroom, powerless to fight back. Yet each assault, each humiliation only sharpened her mind, trained her to survive. She learned to hide fear behind a mask, to obey with precision, to watch and remember. Even in the kitchen, she had her allies, other enslaved women who whispered truths between chopping blocks and fire. They shared stories of herbs, roots, and the natural poisons hidden in plants. Dinah listened, learned, and practiced in secret, careful that no one, not even her closest friends, ever suspected how dangerous her knowledge could become. The plantation was a theater, and Dinah had learned her role perfectly.
She carried trays of silver, polished floors until they shone, and baked bread that smelled of sweetness but was always a reminder of the power she could wield if the right moment arrived. She had learned to laugh quietly when the mistress scolded her, to cry softly when the master raged, and to plan silently, like a spider spinning a web, over time. And the time was coming.
The wedding. When word reached the big house that Catherine Harrow would wed the wealthy Whitmore heir, Dinah knew the opportunities would be endless. The house would overflow with laughter. The tables would groan under the weight of food. The master and his guests would drink deep and careless. 17 names already floated through her mind, faces she had catalogued for years, arrogance etched in every line. Each of these people had wronged her, in ways both small and large. Each of them had looked down at her, dismissed her, or used her as if she were a thing to discard. And now they would sit together, blind in their vanity, while Dinah quietly prepared the instruments of her revenge. In the shadows of the kitchen, she smiled faintly, her hands steady over the spices, the herbs, the wine. She was patient. She was careful. Every detail mattered. A pinch too much, a sip too strong, a touch of the right leaf, and the feast would become their reckoning. Her life had taught her one truth above all else. Those who held power often thought themselves untouchable. But power, Dinah had learned, was fragile, and it could be broken in ways they would never see coming. As she polished the silver for the wedding, her reflection wavered in the gleaming tray. A shadow of a girl who had been stolen from her mother, a woman shaped by cruelty, a mind sharpened by years of oppression. And behind that reflection, a promise glimmered. Rebellion did not always come with fire or chains broken in the night. Sometimes it came in whispers, in shadows, in the smallest of choices that slipped unnoticed past the eyes of the powerful. Dinah learned this truth well. The kitchen was her kingdom, and within it she ruled over secrets. While Mrs. Harrow shouted about centerpieces and lace, while Thomas Harrow swaggered about his fine cigars, Dinah quietly built an arsenal of knowledge from the scraps they never saw. She had memorized the plants that grew along the edge of the swamps, the glossy leaves of water hemlock, the bitter berries of nightshade, the roots that could still a rabbit's heartbeat within minutes. She had learned from the older women who still spoke of Africa, who taught the difference between healing and harming. At night, when the quarters fell silent, Dinah would test tiny portions of these herbs on stray animals she caught in the fields, mice, frogs, once even a wild dog that had wandered too close. She watched, calm and steady, as life drained from them, filing away each reaction in her mind like a careful scholar. One pinch, one sip, one breath too deep. It was not cruelty that guided her experiments, it was precision. She needed to know what worked and how much. A mistake would mean discovery, and discovery would mean death. But there were rebellions too, softer ones, hidden in plain sight. Dinah would slip food to children who had gone hungry, tuck scraps of bread beneath the skirts of women too weary to cook for themselves after the fields. She would take an extra piece of meat from the master's plate, knowing he would never miss it, and pass it to an old man whose ribs showed through his skin. Every kindness was its own act of defiance, a reminder that though they tried to strip her humanity away, it still burned inside her. Yet there were sharper rebellions too. The first time Dinah used her knowledge against the Harrows, it was almost accidental. The overseer, drunk on whiskey, had slapped her across the face one evening in the kitchen, furious that his supper was late. Dinah had pressed her hand to her cheek,
eyes lowered, saying nothing. But the next morning, when his porridge was set before him, she stirred in just enough powdered leaf to make his stomach churn. He spent 3 days bent double, vomiting, his pride broken along with his body. The mistress wailed that it must be bad meat, but Dinah knew better. She knew because she had measured it herself, counted the grains, and hidden the rest in a jar under the floorboard. No one suspected her. No one ever did. That night, as she lay on her thin cot in the cabin, Dinah did not smile. There was no joy in suffering, but there was a grim satisfaction, a reminder that she was not powerless, that knowledge was her weapon, that patience could kill more surely than a blade. She began to test the boundaries more. A guest who had mocked her accent found his wine soured by a subtle bitterness that kept him coughing through the night. A cruel child who kicked the younger enslaved children suddenly could not leave the privy for days. None of these small acts drew suspicion, but they taught Dinah an invaluable lesson. She could strike, and no one would see her hand. The wedding preparations became her cloak. As flour, sugar, spices, and barrels of wine flooded into the kitchen, she had endless opportunities to study, to hide, to prepare. The white family only saw her as a pair of hands, as someone who worked without question. They never saw the mind that watched them, the mind that counted, the mind that plotted. 17. The number began to solidify, sharp and unshakable. She whispered it to herself at night like a hymn. 17. 17 who deserved to taste what they had sown. 17 who would fall one by one while the music still played and the bride still smiled. She was careful, endlessly careful. She knew this was no small rebellion. This was not a stomachache or a cough. This was something final, something history itself would not be able to forget. Dinah's hands worked the dough, pressed the spices, poured the wine. To anyone watching, she was a shadow, silent and obedient. But inside, the fire burned hotter with each passing day. The wedding was drawing near, and Dinah's patience was almost at its end.
The news arrived on a blistering August morning, carried in the shrill voice of Mrs. Harrow as she swept into the kitchen like a storm. "Catherine's to be wed in September," she cried, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "The Whitmores have agreed. We'll have the grandest celebration in the county." Her words sent the kitchen into chaos. Pots clattered, the older women muttered, children darted about, fetching whatever the mistress demanded. To them, it meant more labor, more hours on aching feet, more lashes if things went wrong. But to Dinah, it meant something else entirely. Her hands stilled on the rolling pin. September. That gave her weeks. Weeks to plan, weeks to prepare. The Harrows treated the announcement like a triumph. Invitations were dispatched to every wealthy family for miles. Wagons brought bolts of silk and crates of china. Fiddlers were hired, cooks consulted, tailors summoned. The house swelled with activity, and for once Dinah moved through the chaos unseen. But she saw everything. The guest list, read aloud by Mrs. Harrow in her shrill tone, was carved into Dinah's memory as though by a hot iron. Mr. Whitmore and his wife, their sons, 2 arrogant boys who had once chased an enslaved girl through the fields for sport, Mr. Harrow's brother from Savannah, who sold men like cattle, the overseer who carried his whip like a crown, the mistress's cousins, cruel women who pinched and slapped Dinah for imagined slights, the reverend who preached of obedience while turning his eyes from suffering,
Neighbors, planters, men whose boots had kicked her, whose laughter had carried over the screams of the enslaved. And of course, Thomas Harrow himself. 17. The number settled into her bones, undeniable and precise. Each face was a stone she had carried since childhood. Now all of them would gather in one place, blind in their arrogance, trusting her hands to feed them. The weeks that followed were a blur of labor. The enslaved worked from dawn until stars filled the sky. Cabins were painted white to look clean, though the cracks still showed. Fields were trimmed for carriages, as if neat rows could hide the misery that watered the soil. Dinah moved among it all, quiet, efficient, invisible. She kneaded bread until her arms ached, stirred stews until the scent of spice clung to her skin, polished gulbins until her reflection looked back like a stranger. And all the while she prepared. She gathered herbs in secret, roots pulled from swampy ground, leaves plucked at dawn. She ground them into powders and pastes, careful not to touch too much, careful to hide the jars beneath the kitchen floorboards. She tested her measures again, a scientist in the shadows. Some nights she sat alone in her cabin, candle flickering low, her fingers tracing the air as if writing their names. 17. She spoke them silently, like a prayer, like a curse. There were moments when fear clawed at her. What if she was discovered? What if the wrong person ate? What if the punishment came not only for her, but for all those she loved in the quarters? But no, this was not madness. This was justice. The wedding drew nearer, and with it came the sounds of joy. Catherine Harrow paraded about in silks, dreaming of her new life. The mistress preened as though she herself were to be wed. The master strutted, proud of the union he had secured. No one saw Dinah's eyes, cool and steady, as she laid out the silverware, polished the plates, arranged the feast. No one knew that every movement was part of a plan that would end with 17 bodies writhing on the floor, and the name Dinah whispered in fear and awe long after the music had stopped.
The nights grew shorter as September approached, the air thick with the scent of rain and harvest. Each evening, when the big house went quiet and only the cicadas sang, Dinah lit a stub of candle in her cabin and set her work before her. The floorboard under her cot creaked as she lifted it, revealing the small stash she had hidden over months: jars of ground roots, bundles of dried leaves, seeds wrapped in cloth. Each one held a different kind of power. Some burned the throat, some blackened the stomach, some slowed the heart until it forgot to beat. Dinah handled them with the care of a priestess before an altar. Her fingers moved steadily, weighing powders on the tip of a spoon, grinding seeds into dust, whispering names under her breath, as though binding her vengeance to the herbs. She tested her blends again and again. A touch too much would make the taste bitter, raise suspicion. Too little, and the victims would survive. Precision was everything. The bread would carry one poison, slow, creeping, disguised by the warmth of yeast. The stew another, earthy and bitter, but masked by spices and salt. And the wine, the final stroke, sweetened with a drop of syrup that would carry the deadliest dose of all. It was not enough to kill one or two. No, the plan had to strike like lightning, sudden and unrelenting, leaving no doubt that it was more than accident or spoil. 17 mouths would taste death in unison. 17 bodies would fall. And yet, Dinah was careful. She rehearsed the flow of the wedding day in her mind, the trays she would carry, the goblets she would fill, the laughter she would serve with a bowed head. She imagined herself invisible, her face calm, her eyes lowered. No one would see the storm behind her silence. Sometimes, in the still hours before dawn, fear crept in. She would stare at the jars, her heart pounding. What if someone innocent ate by mistake? What if the children reached for the bread before the masters? But then she remembered the children of the quarters, bare feet bleeding in the fields, bellies swollen with hunger, their cries ignored. She remembered her own mother's scream the night she was taken. No, there were no innocents among the 17. As the day drew closer, she began slipping small amounts of her poisons into dishes served to the household, just enough to test. The mistress complained of headaches that lingered for days. The master's stomach twisted, though he blamed it on brandy. Even the overseer stumbled once in the yard, clutching his side. None of them suspected the quiet pearl in the kitchen. Dinah's confidence grew, tempered by discipline. She never smiled, never faltered, never allowed her hands to shake. Every task, every order, every demand was met with silence and obedience. But inside her, the fire roared. One evening, as she stirred a great pot of stew in the kitchen, Catherine Harrow breezed in, her silk gown swishing, her lips curved in a smug smile. "Make it perfect, girl," Catherine said without looking at her. "It must be flawless. My wedding will be the envy of the county." Dinah bowed her head, her ladle dipping in slow circles. Her eyes never lifted, but her mind whispered, "It will be remembered, mistress. Oh yes, remembered forever." When Catherine swept out, Dinah's hands tightened on the ladle. The kitchen was empty now, the firelight flickering against her face. She leaned closer to the pot and whispered, as though speaking to the stew itself, "Eat, drink, choke, fall." The words shivered through the air like a spell. The poison was ready, the plan was set. All that remained was the wedding day, and Dinah, silent and patient, would serve them their final feast.
The morning broke heavy with heat, the sky a blazing white that promised no mercy. By sunrise, Belclare was alive with chaos. Wagons rolled up the dirt road, spilling out women in silks and men in starched coats, their laughter already too loud, too careless. Catherine Harrow swept about in her gown, glowing with triumph, while Mrs. Harrow snapped orders until her voice cracked. The master strutted like a king. The enslaved scurried like shadows, carrying barrels, arranging flowers, polishing until their knuckles bled. Dinah moved among them, silent as ever. Her face showed nothing. Her hands worked steadily, but in her chest, her heart beat like a war drum. The day had come. By noon, the big house swelled with sound. Violins screeching, voices rising, glasses clinking. The smell of roasted meats and spiced bread filled the air. Dinah stood in the kitchen, ladle in hand, her eyes fixed on the great feast spread before her. Every dish was laced with her touch. Every goblet carried her secret. 17. The number burned in her mind as the guests took their seats. She carried the bread first, her steps light, her eyes lowered. Silver trays gleamed as she placed the loaves before them. No one looked at her. No one ever did. Then the stew, rich, steaming, thick with hidden venom. She ladled it into bowls, the aroma masking the bitter truth beneath. Finally, the wine.
dark, sweet, deadly. She poured it carefully, the liquid glinting red in the candlelight. Goblets lifted, laughter rang, and Dinah whispered, so low no one could hear, "Eat." The first cough came minutes later, muffled beneath a burst of laughter, then another sharper, followed by a gasp. A woman's spoon clattered against her bowl. A man's hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The music faltered. 17 faces twisted in confusion, in pain, in terror. Voices rose, chairs scraped, plates overturned. Catherine's laughter died in her throat, her eyes wide as she clutched her stomach. The master roared, demanding answers, but his own voice broke into a gagging cough. The room erupted. Screams, shouts, the thud of bodies collapsing against polished floors. Silk gowns stained with vomit and spilled wine. The air reeked of death. Dinah stood at the edge of the chaos, her tray balanced in steady hands, her face blank. Around her, the great and powerful of the county writhed like cattle in the slaughter. 17 lives, ended by her silence. No one looked at her. Not yet. The room was too full of panic, too full of death. But she looked at them all, every face, every gasp, every final twitch. And for the first time in her life, Dinah felt something close to freedom. The feast was over.
At first, the guests thought it was chance, bad wine, a sour stomach, a fainting spell from the heat. But then the sickness spread like fire through dry fields. One man toppled from his chair, his face blue, his hands clawing at his throat. Another woman clutched her belly, shrieking until her voice cracked into silence. The bride's veil slipped as she fell forward into her own plate, her silk gown soaking with stew and sweat. The fiddlers dropped their bows. Servants froze, their trays trembling. The grand feast, so carefully arranged, dissolved into madness. Chairs overturned, dishes shattered. Guests crawled across the floor, retching, vomiting, begging for air. A boy, barely grown into manhood, staggered to the door, blood dribbling from his lips, before collapsing in the dirt. The master rose, furious, even as he choked. What have you done?" His words broke into a gurgle as foam flecked his mouth. He crashed against the table, dragging silver and china to the floor with him. Catherine Harrow, the bride, clutched her stomach with shaking hands. Her eyes darted wildly across the room, searching for help, but none came. She fell to her knees, gasping, her white gown stained red from spilled wine. The mistress shrieked until her voice gave way to a strangled hiss. Her pearls snapped as she convulsed, scattering across the floor like tiny white bones. 17 bodies writhed, twisted, collapsed. The air grew thick with the stench of vomit, blood, and fear. Screams filled every corner of the hall, echoing against the high ceilings like the wails of the damned. And through it all, Dinah stood still. Her tray rested against her hip, her head bowed, her expression unreadable. To anyone who glanced her way, she was just another servant, shocked, silent, small. But inside, her heart was steady, her breath calm. The overseer crawled across the floor, his eyes rolling, his hand outstretched toward her ankle. Dinah stepped back, out of reach,
watching as his body seized and went still. Guests who had not yet eaten shrank back from the tables, screaming for help, demanding to be saved. Some fled through the doors, trampling each other in their panic. Others clutched their children, shielding their mouths from the poisoned air as though death itself had seeped into the walls. The wedding feast had become a slaughterhouse. By the time the music had fully died, 17 lay cold, or close to it. A silence heavier than the grave settled over the hall, broken only by the moans of the dying and the frantic sobs of those who had survived. Dinah set her tray down gently, almost reverently, on the edge of the table. She lifted her eyes for the first time, scanning the ruin she had created. 17, just as she had promised herself. Her work was done.
The great hall smelled of death. The sweet perfumes of flowers and wine had been drowned in the stench of vomit and bile. 17 bodies lay still, their fine clothes stained, their faces twisted in their last agony. But not all had fallen. Some survived, pale, shaking, clutching their bellies, but alive. Their voices, hoarse with fear, filled the silence. "Poison," one man rasped, spitting blood onto the floor. It was poison. A murmur spread like a ripple through the survivors. Poison. The word itself was a curse, a terror they could not comprehend. The mistress's sister wailed, clutching her handkerchief to her nose as if the air itself carried death. Another woman shrieked for her carriage, demanding to be taken away from the cursed place. The young groom, now a husband for barely an hour, sat with his bride's body in his arms, rocking and sobbing, his tears staining her veil. The master was gone, the overseer too. Catherine Harrow lay cold in her silk. 17 names snuffed out in a single night. The surviving guests turned their eyes toward the servants. The enslaved stood huddled in the corner, their faces lowered, their bodies trembling. They had served the bread, poured the wine, ladled the stew. And now, in the wreckage of the feast, their silence made them guilty by sight alone. "Who touched the food?" a surviving uncle demanded, his face purple with rage. "Who brought the wine? Which of you dogs did this?" No one spoke. The kitchen slaves stared at the floor, their hearts pounding. They knew the weight of a white man's gaze. They knew that innocence did not matter. The lash, the rope, the bullet, those were the answers that awaited them. Dinah stood among them, her eyes lowered, her hands folded neatly before her. Her face was calm, unreadable, as if carved from stone. One of the women pointed a trembling finger at her. She served the wine. Dinah's chest tightened, but she did not flinch. The uncle's eyes narrowed, sharp as a knife. He stepped forward, towering over her, his breath hot and sour. "Did you touch it, girl? Speak!" Dinah's lips parted, but no words came. Not yet. She had learned the power of silence. To speak too quickly was danger. To protest too much was guilt. The mistress's sister screamed again. "It must be them. They envy us. They hate us. They curse us with their heathen ways." Another woman nodded, trembling. "They should all hang for this." The room seethed with fear and fury. Every eye was on the enslaved. The air was thick with it, heavy as a storm about to break.
Dinah felt the heat of their hatred, but she did not bow beneath it. Inside, she whispered to herself, steady as ever, 17, 17, and no more. But the night was not finished. The survivors would not rest until they had blood to balance the scales. And soon, suspicion would become a noose.
The hall was chaos. Screams, bodies, the stench of vomit and spilled wine. 17 lay still, but others clung to life, their eyes wild with terror, their hands grasping for escape. The surviving guests staggered toward the doors, shouting for carriages, for help, for soldiers. They called for order, but there was none left. Their power had choked with them on the poisoned bread. And then something shifted. The enslaved, who had stood silent in the shadows, stepped forward. It began with one man, Jonah, his broad shoulders hunched from years in the fields. He seized a guest by the collar, slamming him back into his chair. "Sit!" he growled, his voice low and dangerous. The guest struggled, but Jonah's fist cracked against his jaw, silencing him. Another slave caught a woman by the wrist, forcing a goblet back to her lips. "Drink!" Her shriek was cut off as the bitter wine spilled down her throat. She gagged, coughed, but they held her fast until her body went limp. The survivors fought, clawing, pleading, but the enslaved outnumbered them. For once it was not whips and guns that ruled the room, but hands hardened by years of chains. "Eat!" one shouted, shoving a spoonful of stew into a man's trembling mouth. "Drink!" another hissed, forcing a glass between pale lips. The hall became a different kind of slaughterhouse, deliberate, ruthless. Every survivor was dragged back to the tables, their cries drowned by the rage of those who had served them. Dinah watched, her chest heaving, her eyes burning. She had struck the match, but the fire now spread beyond her. The enslaved no longer bowed. They no longer feared. Tonight, the master's feast became their grave. One by one, the survivors choked, writhed, and fell. Plates overturned, goblets shattered, gowns tore beneath struggling hands. The music had long since died, but in Dinah's ears there was a rhythm. The pounding of boots, the gasps of the dying, the whispered word passed between her people, freedom. By the time the torches burned low, there were no white masters left in the hall, no survivors to tell the tale. The wedding feast was a tomb. Dinah lifted her head, her eyes sweeping across the bloodied tables, the ruined gowns, the still faces. For the first time, the silence did not weigh her down. 17 had become 23, then 30, then more. She had lost count. But she knew this: there would be no evidence, no witnesses, no voices left to carry the tale of what had happened that night. The reckoning was complete. The hall was silent now, filled only with the sound of the dying fire and the drip of spilled wine from overturned goblets. The masters were gone. Their heirs, their overseers, their proud guests, gone. The enslaved stood in the ruins of the feast, breathing hard, their hands blooded from the struggle. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, stunned by what they had done. Jonah broke the silence first. "It ain't over," he said, his voice low but steady. "The ones who ain't here will come lookin'. When they do, they'll burn us all." A murmur rippled through the room. Fear, doubt. But Dinah stepped forward, her face lit by the glow of the torches. "No," she said. Her voice was calm, but it carried like thunder. "Not if we strike first." They turned to her, the quiet kitchen slave, the one who had never spoken above a whisper. Now her eyes burned with fire. "They think we weak, they think we blind, but tonight they learn different. Tonight we take more than scraps, we take it all." Her words fell like sparks into dry grass. Heads lifted, backs straightened, a murmur of agreement rose into a growl. Jonah slammed his fist against the table. "To the fields, then! Burn the cane, burn the cotton, burn it all!" The enslaved scattered, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, knives from the kitchen, axes from the woodpile, scythes from the barn. The women carried torches, their flames snapping in the night air. Children clung to their mothers, wide-eyed but silent, as if they too understood the weight of the moment. The first fire rose before midnight, flames devouring the cane fields, turning the night sky red. Smoke billowed thick and choking, a signal that carried for miles. The quarters emptied as others joined, men and women who had lived too long in silence. They poured out with fists and fury, their chains now weapons. The plantation awoke in terror. Those few whites left alive, drivers, distant kin, tried to flee, but they were caught, dragged into the firelight, their pleas silenced with steel and flame. Dinah stood at the heart of it, the torches blazing in her reflection. What began as 17 deaths had become something greater. It was no longer vengeance, it was war.
By dawn, the smoke from Belclare rose like a dark crown over the county. Flames licked the sky, devouring cane fields, barns, and silos. The great house, once a monument to pride and cruelty, was now a blackened skeleton. News traveled fast. By midday, neighboring plantations trembled. The Whitmore's estate, 20 miles away, sent riders galloping back in panic, shouting warnings to anyone who would listen. "The enslaved are rising! Belclare is ablaze!" Dinah moved through the chaos like a shadow, her eyes sharp, her hands steady. She guided the enslaved with quiet authority, giving orders in hushed tones. Some carried torches, others axes, knives, whatever they could grasp. Together, they struck with precision: barns, sugar houses, storehouses. Every target was symbolic: wealth destroyed, oppression burned. Word spread quickly. Other plantations joined the uprising, inspired by the fires and rumors of the massacre at Belclare. Across the county, fields were set alight, overseers hunted, plantations thrown into panic. Farmers fled, guards scrambled, and militias were summoned. But they were few, disorganized, terrified of the sheer fury moving like a wave through the land. In the towns, the enslaved struck wherever opportunity allowed. Supply depots, merchant stores, and the homes of the cruelest planters fell. Messages carried from mouth to mouth: "The time of chains is over." Still, Dinah kept control. She moved among the flames, a silent commander. She knew that chaos could easily consume them all if unchecked. She directed the fires towards wealth, not women or children who were innocent of cruelty, but those who had wielded chains or whip alike. Every act of destruction was calculated, deliberate, a reckoning, not mindless slaughter. By nightfall, the county was ablaze in both fire and fear. Smoke hung heavy in the air, a curtain through which Dinah's people moved like phantoms. They had not only survived, they had turned terror into power. Yet amidst the victories, Dinah's heart remained still. She watched, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and whispered the names of those who had first wronged her, those whose faces would haunt her no more. The flames would burn for days. Word of the uprising would spread like wildfire, a story of vengeance that no white man would easily forget. Belclare had been the spark. Dinah and her people were now the fire.
The fires had burned for 3 days. Smoke hung over the county like a shroud, blackening the sun, marking Belclare and the surrounding plantations as cursed ground. Militias rode hard, muskets gleaming, horses snorting in fear and fury. Planters who had survived their estate's destruction formed crude battalions, shouting orders, brandishing pistols, swords, whips, anything that could strike back at the insurgents. They came with vengeance in their eyes and a hatred that had fermented over decades. Dinah moved silently among the rebels, guiding them through woods, swamps, and fields. She had mapped every escape route, every hidden creek and hollow, every path the militias might overlook. Her voice was calm, precise. "Left, quick, don't scatter, keep together." Even as she led, the weight of her actions pressed on her chest. She thought of the wedding feast, of 17 faces frozen in final terror. She thought of the fires burning across neighboring plantations. She thought of the innocents who had fled or been caught in the flames by accident. Fear and guilt clawed at her, but she could not show it, not now, not while the hunt closed in. The militias were ruthless. They scoured the woods, firing muskets into dark shapes, killing blindly, punishing anyone who looked suspicious. In one skirmish, Dinah watched a young rebel fall, a boy who had never held a weapon before, shot down for his courage. She pressed her hand to his shoulder, dragging him to safety, whispering, "Live, keep going." The hunters began to focus on Dinah. Rumors had spread. The quiet kitchen slave who had served the poisoned feast, the woman whose cunning had led to Belclare's destruction. Her face, once invisible, was now whispered like a curse in the surviving planters' halls. She felt their eyes in the night, imagined the muskets leveled, the traps set in the forests, the bounties on her head. Every step she took was measured, every camp hidden, every path scouted. She had become both leader and hunted. But the rebels trusted her. Her calm in the chaos, her knowledge of poisons, fire, and terrain had saved them repeatedly. They followed her through swamps where the water reached their knees, through forests where shadows threatened to swallow them. And every time the hunters neared, Dinah would slip away into the darkness, leaving only whispers of her passing. Still, the tension was unbearable. She could hear their anger in the distant cries, their horses pounding through the underbrush, the faint cursing that carried across the wind. One night, huddled by a creek, Dinah allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her hands were raw from the cold water, her body aching, her mind racing. "We cannot stop," she whispered to herself. "They will come. They always come. But we have won. We have survived." The fire that had started in Belclare now burned in her chest. She had ignited not just vengeance, but a movement. And while every shadow might conceal a hunter, every flame reminded her people of their power. Dinah's name was no longer whispered in fear of her meekness. It was whispered in fear of her genius, her ruthlessness, and her unbreakable will. The hunt would not end tonight. It would last weeks, months, perhaps years. But Dinah and the rebellion had learned one truth. They were no longer prey. They were the storm. The forests were thick with shadows, the moon slicing through the canopy in silver slivers. The militia rode hard, their torches flickering like angry eyes, their shouts echoing through the night. But Dinah and her people moved faster, slipping through swamps and hidden paths, their movements silent, precise, almost ghostly. She had led them this far. Weeks of fire, blood, and flight had honed their skills and their resolve. She had become more than a leader. She was a shadow that haunted the oppressor's dreams, a storm that no one could fully see. The survivors of the counties whispered of her name with fear, Dinah, the woman who turned the feast into death, the shadow in the swamps, the fire in the cane fields. Dinah never stayed in one place long enough for capture. Every town she passed through saw her only as a blur, a servant rushing through the night, leaving nothing behind but legend. Families who had hunted her discovered only smoke, footprints lost to rain, and whispered rumors. But the stories grew taller with every telling. Some said she carried a blade sharp as a serpent's fang. Others said she could slip unseen through the densest forest, moving like wind itself. And some said she had walked into the flames of Belclare herself and emerged untouched, unburned, laughing in the firelight. No bounty could claim her. No militia could trap her. She had become something else, more than human, more than enslaved, more than vengeance itself. Dinah vanished into the south, leaving towns trembling and plantations empty, and the enslaved whispering her name as a promise of resistance, of power, of freedom. Some swore they saw her once, standing on a ridge, watching the sun rise over a burned field, her silhouette framed by smoke. Her eyes, they said, burned with fire and steel. And then she was gone again, as if the land itself had swallowed her whole. Generations would speak of her, not the kitchen slave who served bread and wine, but Dinah the unseen, Dinah the fire, Dinah the storm, a ghost who turned vengeance into legend, whose wrath and cunning would echo long after the last plantation burned. She was everywhere and nowhere, and in every whispered telling her story grew, impossible to capture, impossible to forget.
Long after the fires at Belclare faded and the smoke over neighboring plantations cleared, her name lived on. The enslaved whispered it in the quarters at night, their voices low, trembling with awe and fear. Dinah walks still. She will come if the masters grow too bold. Remember her fire. Stories spread from county to county. Some said she had vanished into the swamps, leading the survivors to new lives, teaching them to fight, to hide, to resist. Others said she haunted the forests, appearing as a shadow by candlelight, a warning to those who would enslave again. Even white planters murmured her name, though carefully, behind closed doors. A ghostly specter of vengeance who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish before anyone could answer. Years turned into decades. The children of the enslaved learned of her courage, of her intelligence, of the night she turned a wedding feast into history. They told her story in hushed tones, passing it from mother to daughter, father to son. Dinah became legend, a symbol of resistance, cunning, and freedom. No one ever captured her. No one ever held her accountable. She was more than a woman. She was an idea, a storm that could never be chained. And somewhere, in the dark swamps, forests, and fields of the South, they said she still moved. Dinah the unseen, Dinah the fire, Dinah the storm, watching, waiting, remembering. Her story endured, whispered on the wind,
a testament to the strength of the oppressed and a warning to those who would ever seek to break them again.